G'day and welcome to the Fred Paul Show. There are alarming political developments going on in Brazil right now that are plunging the nation into what looks certain to be a tragic and frightening state of totalitarian dictatorship for its citizens and a bonanza for the kleptocrats who run the place under the watchful eye of China. Why should we Australians be concerned about this? Well, there are two very big reasons, apart from whether we should reconsider booking a beach holiday in Rio de Janeiro. Firstly, what's going on in Brazil looks suspiciously similar to what's happening here, only on a milder scale. But if we don't reverse direction in Australia, the descent of Brazil into a totalitarian nightmare will become less a warning than a premonition. It starts with a corrupt megalomaniac reassuming power as the president. In late 2022, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was elected president of Brazil for the second time. His first term, from 2003 to 2011, was tainted by evidence of corruption, which led to him spending time in jail. This term is already shaping up to be a repeat. Unlike Australia, liberal democracy is not the norm in Brazil. It only emerged from military dictatorship in the late 1980s, and even the period of relative stability since then has not been entirely free from South American-style gangster politics. So Lula has been able to take advantage of a favourable cultural environment to revive the suppression and corruption he enjoyed last time he was in office. The legacy of that last term included evidence of widespread corruption that finally made it to court in 2017, when Lula was found guilty of taking bribes and packed off to jail. The ensuing legal battles were typically South American, with judges being accused of bias and legal technicalities being found that eventually sprang Lula from jail after more than a year behind bars. Lula's opponent in the 2022 presidential election was incumbent Jair Bolsonaro, whose opposition to abortion, gay marriage and COVID lockdowns earned him not only the affection of the mostly Catholic electorate, but the inevitable far-right label from the international media. When Bolsonaro surprisingly lost the 2022 election to Lula, millions of Brazilians took to the streets to protest, suggesting the vote was rigged. In the past week, the Australian and Brazilian governments have both revealed they have an uncannily similar aversion to free speech, especially on X, the social media platform previously known as Twitter. The Australian government, through its e-safety commissioner, aggressively threatened to sue X fine X, unless it took down a post by a conservative Canadian character called Billboard Chris that was justifiably critical of an Australian transgender person who had been recently appointed to a World Health Organization advisory committee. And then over in Brazil, the government on the weekend, just yesterday, contacted X and told them to shut down accounts it found contrary to its totalitarian agenda. That rang alarm bells all over the world. Independent journalist Michael Schellenberger, who is based in the United States, raced down to Brazil to report on it. Here is what he filed this morning.
At 5:52 p.m. Eastern Time today, April 6, 2024, X Corporation, formerly known as Twitter, announced that a Brazilian court had forced it to, quote, block certain popular accounts in Brazil. Then, less than 1 hour later, the owner of X, Elon Musk, announced that X would defy the court's order and lift all restrictions. As a result, said Musk, we will probably lose all revenue in Brazil and have to shut down our office there. But principles matter more than profit, he added. At any moment, Brazil's Supreme Court could shut off all access to X Twitter for the people of Brazil. It is not an exaggeration to say that Brazil is on the brink of dictatorship at the hands of a totalitarian Supreme Court justice named Alexandre de Moraes. President Lula da Silva is also participating in this push towards totalitarianism. Since taking office, Lula has massively increased government funding of the mainstream corporate news media, most of which are encouraging increased censorship. What Lula and Moraes are doing is an outrageous violation of Brazil's constitution as well as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. At this moment, Brazil is not yet a dictatorship.
Sound familiar? Well, we in Australia are not a dictatorship yet either, but we will be if Albo gets his misinformation and disinformation bill up later this year, which, combined with the digital ID bill that passed the Senate last week, will make us less like our cultural predecessors, Britain and the United States, and a hell of a lot more like China. Speaking of which, that is the other aspect of Brazil's current politics that should ring alarm bells for us in Australia. If you thought China's aggression in the Western Pacific is dangerous, which it is, think about the consequences of China becoming the puppet master in Brazil, which it soon will be. Brazil is 8.5 million square kilometres in size. The United States, just a few thousand kilometres north, is only slightly larger at 9.8 million square kilometres. Its population, Brazil's population in 2022 was 215 million, compared to the United States population of 333. So whoever controls Brazil controls a huge economy and landmass and population within missile range of the United States mainland. Brazil became a founding member of the BRIC alliance, that's BRIC, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India and China, during Lula's last term as president in 2006. The alliance is meant to provide an international trading group using Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. It is also a handy vehicle for Chinese foreign investment and political influence. It has since been joined by South Africa, Egypt, Iran and the United Arab Emirates. Well, what does all this mean for Brazil and, more importantly, what does it mean for us here in Australia? Let's bring in Brazilian-born West Australian law academic Augusto Zimmermann to discuss it. Augusto, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Fred. It's a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Your insight into this and your legal mind is particularly relevant amidst all this. The developments of the weekend are just the latest example of Lula's political agenda. How close do you think Brazil is now to totalitarianism?
Well, I think Brazil is already in a totalitarian environment. So the comments made by Michael Schlesberger or whatever, the journalist, are very correct. But I would just fix one comment he made, that we are on the road to a totalitarian outcome. I don't think so. I think Brazil is already a totalitarian regime, and this has been implemented by judges, unelected judges, with the tacit support or perhaps even the instructions coming from the executive, from the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, who won an election in a very suspicious manner because he is definitely not popular in the country. And I would not expect that such an unpopular politician would be able to obtain an electoral victory.
Well, let's get back to the election in a minute. But first, can you just tell me how bad or how non-existent the separation of powers is in Brazil? I mean, you're saying that the president is telling the Supreme Court what to do. That's not something that we accept here in a British sort of parliamentary democracy, but that's not the case in Brazil.
Well, look, De Moraes, together with, that's the name of the electoral chief justice, he was overseeing the elections. And he was, prior to becoming an electoral judge, the state minister in São Paulo, one of the biggest states in Brazil. And he worked for the current vice president of the republic, who ultimately managed, together with his group, to appoint him as Justice of the Supreme Court. So the whole process is conducted with the assistance of highly suspicious judges who have had in the past very strong links to President Lula and other politicians of the left-wing leaning. So that is also a problem. But I can tell you that nobody really believes in Brazil that these judges act in a proper manner and in accordance with the rule of law. It's quite to the contrary, and it's affecting not only free speech in Brazil, but I must say that this is affecting free speech across the globe, because there is now information available to basically state or say that some foreigners have also been included in the censorship by the Brazilian government with the tacit compliance of the social media, including the likes of Google, Twitter, and Facebook and WhatsApp. So it's not just Brazil is being affected. So this is actually impacting the whole world, the free speech across the globe.
Yeah, I've got to say, I was looking for certain Brazilian content this afternoon that I do know exists because I saw it when it first happened, just after the election. But if you Google it, it doesn't exist anymore, according to Google. These methods, Augusto, of censorship are frighteningly similar. I mean, it's 1 week apart. The Australian government is trying to censor, through its proxy in the e-Safety Commission, is trying to censor contrary views that it doesn't like, and now we see exactly the same approach happening in Brazil. I mean, it's easy to come up with conspiratorial theories at this point, Augusto. Do you think it's paranoid to see these connections and think that there's someone above these governments pulling the strings?
No, there's no doubt that what you're saying is completely right. It's not conspiracy theory because it has even been reported that this is the case by not very reliable, in my opinion, but very left-wing media outlets such as the New York Times. But what I have to say is that in 2021, and I have written an article about that, the name of the person is Jack Sullivan. He is the U.S. National Security Advisor under the Biden administration. He visited Brazil to make sure that the elections would not be contested, the electronic voting system would not be questioned. And Jair Bolsonaro was then the president of Brazil, and he was put under enormous pressure by the Biden administration to do nothing about an entirely electronic electoral voting system. Then this other person, who is William Burns, the CIA director, actually also went to Brazil in July, visited Brazil in July 2021 to make sure that the Brazilians would not, especially including the president, I must say, would not question or cast in doubt, as he says, about the country's entirely electronic process. My problem with this is that why on earth the oligarchs all across the world, just after the outcome was released of the election, came with statements congratulating the elected left-wing crooked politician, saying that the elections were won in a fair and transparent manner. Why on earth they had to mention that the elections were fair and transparent? We would suppose to be the case always that elections have to be fair and transparent. So that raises a lot of suspicion that the elections were neither fair nor transparent.
Well, that's another thing that Australia and Brazil have in common, is that their current governments are nominally left-wing, but seem to represent the elitists in their own countries and the elitist cabal from the WEF or the United Nations. Now, you're saying, though, that the CIA somehow, or through its insistence that the electronic voting system remained in place, which gave, supposedly, Lula the opportunity to rig the election. But Lula's election would favour China. Why would the CIA want China's proxy in Brazil?
Well, we cannot forget, and I have written articles for The Spectator demonstrating a connection between some American oligarchs since the 1970s, for instance, with the CCP, the Communist Party of China. One of the oligarchs, Rockefeller, actually wrote an article in the New York Times praising Mao Zedong for being a wonderful administrator when he was in the process of killing millions and millions of innocent people. Oh, I'm not so sure whether the Chinese government has ceased to, get its own understanding of reality and its own worldview, not from the founder. And the founder, Mao Zedong, proposed the extermination of the undesirable. And he actually told us that this was a necessary thing to implement the communist revolution. The virus was released from Wuhan. And don't forget that this was sponsored and received the funds from a certain agency in America. And Anthony Fauci was directly responsible for this.
Augusto, you mentioned earlier that Jair Bolsonaro is very popular in Brazil. It's difficult to find evidence of that again. If you Google it, you won't find much evidence of it. What's your take? How popular is he from your perspective?
Well, look, he is very popular, and the point with him is that he tried to play by the rules. So the very opposite that has been executed by his political opponent. And the main means by which the system was corrupted, I would say, was through the erratic and arbitrary behavior of certain judicial culprits. And I refer here in particular to this Alexandre, as we would say in Portuguese, Alexandre de Moraes, who is the electoral chief justice and also a justice of the Supreme Electoral Court in Brazil, which basically canceled almost everyone who supported more directly the president, arresting people, freezing the bank accounts, behaving as a total autocrat. And to be frank with you, it's not even possible to say that we still have a normal democracy in that country because everybody is afraid of speaking out their minds. Speaking up about these issues can cost very dearly to people. Most Brazilians don't have the courage to manifest their opinions anymore. There's no such thing as free speech in that country.
Augusto, you've just published a book which is gaining a lot of critical acclaim called The Unlucky Country about Australia. Should Australians be worried that we are heading in the same direction as Brazil? Is this a premonition for where we're heading?
Well, look, Lula was supported by the Australian elites or oligarchies. I don't know how to say this in these days. But he got the support of global oligarchs from all across the world. I have mentioned that as soon as the election, the outcome was released or announced, all these usual suspects from the European Union, the Canadian Prime Minister, the woke Canadian Prime Minister, and many others, including the UK Prime Minister, went all to celebrate the victory. So they are supporting the destruction of my native country, which makes me very upset, I must say. So Brazil is a lab, even a testing ground for the likes of those who control, for instance, the Labour Party here in Australia. And the introduction of this disinformation bill will spell the end of the rule of law and democracy in Australia as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a very blatant attempt to force us to shut up, just like people are being told to shut up in Brazil. Now, Augusto, there's tens of thousands of Brazilians in Australia. The number has grown considerably in the past few years. I've got to say, the surfing beaches of Sydney are inhabited mostly by Brazilians these days. Yeah, good blokes, most of them too. So, but how are they feeling? Well, I mean, some of them must be feeling that it's almost dangerous to go home these days.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it requires a bit of bravery to visit Brazil after complaining or criticizing the behavior of certain characters in the country, especially judges. But some of these people are literally speaking political refugees. They have given up of living in a country where we can be canceled for whatever reason that can be regarded by the elites as undesirable to the advancement of the oligarchical interests. So basically, Bolsonaro is being punished for trying to do the right thing, for being an outsider, and basically trying to break up with hundreds of years of oppression by the ruling classes in that country. Brazil has a tremendous potential, but it has always been controlled by crooks and corrupt politicians, which Lula da Silva so much represents as the leading ruler over the country.
Well, I hope the Brazilians in Australia can help the rest of Australia realise where we're heading, because I do see Brazil as a warning about the direction that Australia is heading in. Augusto, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Fred. It's always a pleasure.
That's West Australian law academic Augusto Zimmermann, and pick up his book, The Unlucky Country. It's a critique of where Australia's heading at the moment, and Augusto has magnificent insights.